Hello. Today I'd like to talk with you about knowledge co-production in coastal social ecological systems. The structure of my talk is as follows. I start off with unpacking knowledge and knowledge co-production, asking what they are. I then provide a simple framework for learning in knowledge co-production, and then give some examples from a recent study called MAGIC, which I led. MAGIC is for multi-scale adaptations to global change in coastlines, and then provide conclude with some lessons that we learned, and then I end up with a suggestion for further reading. So what is this thing called knowledge? We can unpack knowledge in two dimensions. The first one is formality, whether it's explicit in the scientific domain, in other words, or tacit. And we can also look at scale and ask ourselves whether this knowledge is local or universal. And this leads us then to this two-dimensional sort of framework, which we published as part of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So on this axis, the formality of knowledge can be ranged from informal, sustainable use of ecosystems, customs and traditions, seminars, conferences, and also social media, of course, on the informal side. And then on the formal side, we talk about compliance monitoring, ecological research at the local level. And then at the universal level, we talk about space programs, NASA, IPCC, these global conventions and global change models. And then, yes, as I said, from local to universal, we can see that in the top right, we've got some highly formal universal knowledge systems. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we've got some informal and very localized knowledge systems. And our challenge in knowledge co-production is to actually combine these different knowledge sources and forms and create synergies between them. And the reason is that we need to address complexity. Without knowledge co-production, it's very difficult to address the complexity that we see in these coastal social ecological systems. We need collaboration. It needs to be inclusive, participatory, and also flexible. And it can lead and also requires new types of governance, adaptive governance, multi-scale governance. We need trusted relationships, either as a consequence of knowledge co-production, but also as a prerequisite for it. And there's nothing like mistrust to damage the process of knowledge co-production. And in the end, knowledge co-production is really a process of social learning, which is what the rest of my talk is really about. And this knowledge co-production cycle illustrates that it's a dynamic process. So this is a paper by Catherine Vincent and colleagues, published in Climate Services. And what it says is you've got this co-production cycle, has to start with identifying the actors and build partnerships, then co-explore the need, then co-develop a solution to that need, and then co-deliver the solution, and then evaluate how it's worked. And so here at the center then is continuous monitoring, knowledge exchange, and learning. And they came up with this reflexive review and refine of processes, the process principles being inclusive, collaborative, and flexible. And the product should be decision-driven, should be process-based, and they say it should be time-managed. In other words, there should be a beginning and an end to this cycle. So we developed a very simple framework for learning. And it really hinges on three pillars. It's who to learn with, what to learn about, and how to learn. And this then could be the foundation for transformative research. What we found was that in terms of who to learn with, you have to involve actors across the disciplinary knowledge network. And you have to involve experts, novices, and bridging agents in the process. What to learn about is put history at the center. History matters. Incorporate values, integrate existing knowledge, identify shared concepts, and co-create an aspirational common future, that common vision that everyone can subscribe to. And then how to learn is by embracing boundary objects and by uniting in third places. And this was published in a paper led by De Grue about transdisciplinary research for systemic change, where this framework was put forward in 2017. So now we turn to some examples from a recent project on coastal ecosystems called MAGIC. So MAGIC stands for Multi-Scale Adaptations to Global Change in Coastlines. And MAGIC addressed complex systems, it addressed the ocean and adaptation in coastlines as a series of wicked problems driven by uncertainties. And it had 3 study localities. The first one was the Garden Route in South Africa, then the Camargue in France, the Camargue wetland system, and then Cornwall in the United Kingdom. So who did we learn with in MAGIC? In MAGIC, we learned with actors across the knowledge network. We involved experts, novices, bridging agents. Here's just a list of some of the actors we involved. If you work in 3 countries, in 3 regions, in multiple contexts, then you need a multidisciplinary consortium. So we had 9 permanent researchers, 3 postdocs, 4 PhDs, and more than 10 undergrad students over 3 years, because that was the duration of the Belmont Forum funding that we had. And we involved people from the disciplines of economics, environmental economics, ecology, water science, conservation, geography, and we incorporated social science, mathematical modeling, political science, political ecology, agent-based modeling, and then a range of participatory engagements as part of this transdisciplinary research. It was very important for the team to also learn together. And here we used informal learning, recreational activities, getting together in strange places and doing things together so that we could bond and get to understand each other's points of view and where we were coming from, our respective strengths and weaknesses. Slightly more formally, we also got together in this case in a pub actually in Cornwall. The teams got together and spent not just a few days, but 4 weeks together, eating together, cooking together, going on excursions together. And we did this throughout the project. At least twice a year, we took turns in hosting these events in the 3 focal countries and 3 focal institutions involved. Now let's turn to what to learn about in this MAGIC case study example. Well, we really just learned about complexity in coastlines. Here's an example of complex cross-scale feedbacks that you get. For example, when you get development and transformation of an estuary, exposure to floods, constraint of water flow, siltation and then increases in flood risk. And then you get a response, which is artificial breaching of the estuary. And this further reduces the water flow, prevents the natural flush, and accelerates siltation in a very vicious cycle. And here's another part of the loop, and that is when the fire risk increases because the vegetation on the riverbanks accumulate and become a fire risk. We also learned about maladaptation. Maladaptation being an action taken to avoid vulnerability to climate change in this instance, but it impacts adversely on or increases the vulnerability of other systems or sectors or social groups. So here's an example of traps that can result, starting with external drivers, extreme weather, tourism growth, migration, pressure to raise revenue, and more recently we could probably add COVID as well. You get property development near the water, and people invest in these properties and develop some kind of a place attachment, which creates a trap for them because they can't move away from these risky areas. So you've got flood risk of these waterside properties. They put pressure on authorities to open the river mouth or the estuary artificially. You get sand accumulation, reduced intensity of flushing, combustible vegetation buildup, fire risk, and these vulnerabilities and risks then get transferred from some owners, property owners, to others. So this is just one example of maladaptation and how you actually need a multidisciplinary team to understand these interactions and feedbacks between these variables. But there were also promising adaptations. And we need to monitor those pathways. For example, integrated spatial development frameworks, and then restoration of ecological infrastructure, and then creating jobs through this. For example, the Working for Water program, and then hope spots would be another one. And of course, nature-based solutions recently got an enormous amount of traction in funding as a response to the threats of climate change. Lastly, how to learn. Well, the first thing we discovered is that you do need shared conceptual frameworks to put the team members at least in the same sort of ballpark and mode of thinking. And here we used we used the conceptual framework developed by Marty Andreessen and Eleanor Ostrom in 2004, the social ecological systems framework. And it's got 4 dimensions. It's got the resources and land. It's got the resource users, which are the residents, landowners. It's got the public infrastructure providers who regulate in these interactions. And then there's the public infrastructure. It could be real estate. It could also be even policies. And what we then modeled were these arrows. So how these different components of the social ecological system were actually influencing outcomes at multiple scales. But we also needed a framework for individual cognitive perceptions if we wanted to be truly multi-scaled. And here the Grotman and Pat framework became quite handy. And what it really does is it looks at these adaptive actions and strategies and the choices that people make. They result in outcomes. Then there's, of course, this sort of learning and reflection to see what these outcomes are actually achieving, and then how this affects adaptation and how this affects people's appraisal of risk and how this affects people's appraisal of their adaptive capacity. So these 2 frameworks enabled us to look at this problem of adaptation in coastlines at a number of very different scales, but also incorporating the individual cognitive perception scale. And then with decision makers, we used a series of serious games and developed those as a way of giving feedback to decision makers. So here's an example in France where people were shuffling cards around in a game that was developed by the colleagues in Ercia in France around infrastructure development. This game was eventually, by one of the postdocs, was developed into a computer model where the players could actually sit behind a computer and move around different infrastructures and then look at their knock-on effect on vulnerability and vulnerability transfer. More informally even, there was this magic project artifact, and it looked at these 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 key challenges faced by decision makers. Decision makers then can arrange them on a table in terms of a pathway and define how they're going to address each of these challenges in the stack along the pathway of development. So townhouse meetings and public gatherings then became part of the mechanism of feedback of the magic project. Trust building was central and reduced the social distance, not in the sense now of the COVID era, but social distance as a metaphor for knowledge exchange and proximity of thinking between academics, decision makers, civil society, and this thing of raising curiosity. So putting these problems on the table, putting these artifacts on the table and getting people to be curious. We also used interviews and dialogues and participatory action research, collected some secondary data, and then developed some of these models about institutional adaptations. And then, of course, this feedback, reflection, and learning, and in the hope that this will ultimately lead to participatory planning around coastal vulnerability and coastal adaptation. So some conclusions then. The first conclusion is that knowledge co-production in complex systems is all about learning. It's learning within the team, it's learning across disciplines, across knowledge networks. It's learning that involves novices, practitioners, and seasoned experts. And that one needs a diversity of cultural and geographic contexts so that you can do comparative analysis and comparative learning and transfer these lessons from one locality to the next. Trust and respect are crucial right from the start, but it needs to develop. And competition is the enemy of knowledge co-production. It doesn't matter who gets credit. That's the motto. Enjoyment is important. Endorphins enhance creativity. It's been shown over and over. And having fun is absolutely central to knowledge co-production. And then making use of all the different types of technologies and methods and social processes that are available. Be daring, combine them to explore and learn together. Lastly, some further reading. We produced a special issue in Regional Environmental Change in October 2019, kindly edited by Marty Andries and Olivier Baudo, and it's about governance principles for robust and resilient coastal systems in the face of global change, and contains 27 articles. And then finally, I would just like to give credit to this very big magic team, our colleagues in France, at CNRS, at a variety of French institutions, University of Exeter, and in the United States, in the university, and at Arizona State University, and then at Nelson Mandela University, of course. Thank you very much for your attention.